Psychology is fascinating, especially when you look at the evolution of psychology as a practice. But also, it's very weird that we all collectively agree with psychology as it exists today. And I say that as somebody whose special interest is the evolution of psychology and psychiatric practices and treatments. If we've never met, my name is Heather. I am a late diagnosed ADHD and autistic human, and I make videos about my life experience, and one of those life experiences is a special interest in the weird topic of psychology. So everything I say today is opinion. I am not a psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, anything of the sort. Just something that I have spent a lot of time researching, I find fascinating, and I would like to talk about it. So let's talk about it today. So the origins of psychology, really, and I'm not going to cite a bunch of people and a bunch of time frames. You can go back and look at all this stuff if you want to. You can Google it. It's fascinating. But really, it all started when a bunch of old white dudes sat around and decided to figure out why people do what they do, why we behave the way we behave, and why people think the way that they think. And there were a ton of different schools of thought on this, right? It goes all the way back to the early philosophers trying to examine human behavior and why it is that we do these things. And then astrology came around and we use those to explain why people do the things they do. And then you had different camps and schools of thought about, you know, the evolution of why people think this way, their behaviors. You had Freud, you had Jung on two opposite sides of the spectrum who used to be friends but then parted, that had different schools of thought on why people do things and what their motives are and why their brains work the way that they do. But in truth, these philosophies and ideas were really kind of considered a pseudoscience, and it wasn't legitimized as a practice to actually help people until the chemistry came into play. When another bunch of old white dudes got together and tried to figure out the chemicals in the brain and how they work and how their interplay affects our behavior, that's when we started gaining some legitimacy. But it still wasn't actually a science. It was just a practice, and it's still kind of considered a practice. But think about some of the earlier treatments for mental health and how those treatments differed based on your sex and based on your color, how we treated people and their behaviors differently based on our IDs and ideals of societal expectations at the time. Of course, there was a time that women, if you were sad and you weren't wifing hard enough or momming hard enough, your husband could have you committed, and they would literally strap a smile to your face to make you happier, or they would give you electroshock therapy, or, then came the lobotomy. We'll just take out parts of that frontal lobe. You don't need that. Don't be sad. Don't be anything. And just these ideas as they evolved that we thought were just the height of science at the time that they came out. They were the treatment, the only acceptable way to deal with anything. And now we look back at these things and go, oh, how barbaric. That was insane. Why would we have done such a thing? Well, because at that time we thought that was how things worked. And that was going to be the way that we took care of people's mental health. Then things evolved. We used those scientific methods and determined the chemicals in the brain that create certain emotions, that suppress certain emotions. And we figured out that we could use medications to enhance or decrease some of those chemicals. And that's when psychology and psychiatry became a legitimized system of treatment for mental health. But even in the early stages of that, the medications that came out were not necessarily safe or helpful. We really like to think that we know a lot as a society on how to best handle the mental health of the public, what those things mean for us in general, the approved treatments for such things. But if you go back 100 years, we really didn't know jack, and we thought the same thing. We thought that we knew exactly what we were doing, that it was correct, that this treatment was helping people, even if it was definitely harming them. And again, the roles, as in what sex you were and what color you were, played a huge part in the treatments that you received, if you received treatment at all, or, as in the case with many people of color and many mentally disabled people, if you were used to experiment on. That's the truth of the matter. A lot of the information that we do have about how the brain works and how things play out in behavioral treatments came from torturous methods used on people that were marginalized, that society did not deem worthy and felt comfortable exacting experiments on. But at each level of this progression, we societally said, yeah, that tracks. We'll believe that. We'll do that. That's the right thing to do. And again, when we look back, we realize how foolish some of those things were. And I can't help but wonder if in 100 years from now, we're going to look back at the treatments that we deem, the gold standard now and think, oh my gosh, how silly we were. We knew so little. Because even though we have nailed down a lot of science regarding psychology and the way the brain functions and the interaction and interplay of chemicals and how that affects our behaviors and our mental state, and we have found medications to treat, it's all really a lot of guesswork still. Because unfortunately, because everyone's brain does work differently, the interplay of those chemicals does not affect everyone equally. And the fact that women were left out of the conversation, both medically and psychology, for so long and were not used in experiments and in treatment protocols because we were so unpredictable because of our hormones, says a lot about how we treat women's mental health today. Because today, in the year of our Lord, 2025, we know so much about hormones and their interplay with other systems in the body. We know that sex hormones do not just affect the body presentation that you have. They affect the way your entire body works. There's so much interplay with hormones that we consider sex hormones, or hormones that we consider female hormones like estrogen, even though men also have estrogen, that the way a female presents with her mental health in, say, the luteal stage of her cycle versus the ovulation stage of her cycle will probably be two totally different presentations. But say you are in crisis, and part of that crisis has to do with the fact that your hormones are in a huge flux state, and you go to seek help, and you are given a diagnosis of something that doesn't necessarily fit you because of the way you are presenting at that one singular point in time in your life. We're still doing that. We're still doing that. And we're also not factoring in, when we prescribe these medications, how they fluctuate in their effectiveness based on the interplay of those hormones. A prime example is how women are currently treated when they hit perimenopause, when those hormones flux and leave and freak out, and how that affects the way our brain functions and how we work. And so many doctors, from gynecologists to psychologists, prescribe antidepressants, when really what is needed is more study in the interplay of how those brain chemicals are affected by the withdrawal and flood of those hormones. Why are we putting a Band-Aid, basically doing, the same science as lobotomies, on women and not taking into account such a huge factor in the day-to-day overall picture of our mental health? We still are looking at a snapshot of what they are in that moment, in a moment of crisis, because that is usually when you go seek help, right? A moment of crisis. If things aren't going great in your life, you're probably not sitting there going, I should go see a psychiatrist. Things are fantastic right now. No, it's when everything falls apart that you go to get help. But we still deny, in men and women, the interplay of these hormones with our brain chemicals. We know so much now about the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis, and how those hormones and those proteins and things interact with each other, how they lead to the chemicals in the brain fluctuating. But again, we still refer back to this book, the 5th version of a book that changes every time it comes out. And we go, okay, well, you meet, check these things. So this is what you have. And flip. All right, this is the prescribed treatment for what you have. So we're going to give you this, this, and this. And that'll make you better. Come back in a month and tell me how you're doing. And maybe it does make you better. Maybe it makes you feel great for a week. But then the next week, those hormones are in a totally different place. And things in your life have shifted. And the stressors at work or the stressors at home or the stressors in your life have changed. And now those chemicals in your brain are not the same chemicals that you had last week because they're in flux too. They're affected by these external changes. They're affected by the internal changes. But yet we're still going, all right, let's slap that Band-Aid on. And that Band-Aid's going to take care of everything, regardless of the fluctuations, regardless of the changes. Or we say, go to therapy, because the medication can't do it all. You need to go to therapy and you need to work out these things. But that's still just a snapshot of how you were that day when you talked to your therapist. If you're having a great day on the day that you have your therapy appointment, you're probably forgetting all the stuff that happened the week before that you really needed to talk to somebody about. So the therapist is only getting the snapshot of you in that moment. Over the years, historically, with new information, treatments, and ideals on what disorders were changed as we gained new information. But it seems like it's kind of come to a standstill if you look at that history. That we're doing the same practices that we were decades ago, even though the book has changed and maybe the check marks changed and maybe the subheading changed. The practices still are pretty much the same. And if you look at things on a grand scale, I would have to say largely ineffective. Now, again, this is all just my opinion, my overview of, again, someone who has studied and really taken a special interest in the evolution of mental health treatments, of psychology, of how we got to where we are. But I also am looking at, where do we go from here? Do we all keep relying on this one book as though everyone's experiences are universal? Do we continue to take snapshots of people's lives and make diagnoses with no disclaimer that says conditions are subject to change? Do we still tell people, you have this and you will have this for the rest of your life and you will need treatment and medication and therapy for the rest of your life, despite knowing that their life's going to change? Their circumstances will change. Their internal biology will change. And that will change their presentation. That will change their mental health. We put labels on things and then change labels. We medicate and then change the proper medications. But we don't tell people that, hey, things change. Your life is going to be different from day to day to day. And giving you this diagnosis and giving you these medications is not to make you think that you're incapable of handling those changes. They are to help you find footing so that you can make these changes. And of course, as someone who makes and creates content based on a diagnosis that I received from this fabulous little book, it might seem kind of ironic and maybe hypocritical to say the things that I'm saying. Why am I identifying with these diagnoses that I got if I don't believe that any of this stuff is actually concrete? Because for me, the diagnoses that I did receive now do fit. But I also have been misdiagnosed, mismedicated, mismanaged, and grossly mishandled for the majority of my life by the psychiatric community. The treatments that I got were ineffective. I never had anyone ask me how I was really doing when I went to an appointment to get medication refilled. I never had anyone really check to see what was going on in my life. I remember sitting at a psychiatrist's office and telling them that in the past month I had changed jobs, moved homes, and married. And they didn't ask me a single question. Just said, okay, so we'll keep this at the same dosage. All right, we'll see you next month. Tell me how that's an effective system to treat the ever-changing lives of the people that they're serving. I'm not dogging out psychology. I'm not saying that it does nothing for us. I'm just saying that things do need to change. We've changed our ideals of what works so many times, over and over again. And each time we're presented with new information as a society, we sit back and go, yeah, that tracks. You're right. You got it figured out. All right, let's do that. And then it becomes very difficult to break out of those paradigms because we have collectively agreed that this is the way we do things, and we're going to continue to do it that way because we can't promise you that anything we do differently will work any better. But I do think that moving forward, from a scientific perspective, we need to start taking into account the way the chemicals in our body affect our brain functionality, affect our behavior. We need to take into account that almost everyone has dealt with some kind of complex, continual interpersonal trauma in their lives. And that affects how their behavior outwardly reflects. We need to take into account that people that don't necessarily have financial means are struggling at different levels than people that do. They have different things to consider, different stressors in their everyday lives, and treating all brains as just an organ that functions this way in everyone and this medication will work for everyone is not effective. It's not a good paradigm, and it's not really working for us. So if you found this kind of conversation interesting, I would appreciate it if you'd leave me a comment and let me know. If you'd like to know more about the actual history of psychology with citations and dates and photos and all, let me know that too, because I can do a more in-depth deep dive into how psychology as practice evolved, particularly in the United States, but worldwide as well. And if you enjoyed this type of content, last but not least, I ask you to please give me a subscribe, give me a like, hit that little bell so you get notified when new videos like this come out. I enjoy having conversations, tough conversations about my life, about my experiences, and about mental health in general, because again, that is a special interest for me. So I thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this and found my little rant on psychology interesting, and I hope to see you in the next one. All right. Thanks. Love you. Bye.